Good evening and welcome from a very wet and windy Limerick this evening to the second in the panel series on the topic of terminology in childhood speech sound disorder, coming from the Child Speech Committee of the International Association of Communication Science and Disorders, which you may also know as IALP. My name is Aileen Wright. I'm the head of the School of Allied Health at the University of Limerick and also a speech and language therapist and lecturer in speech and language therapy. I'm also a member of the International Association of Communication Sciences and Disorders Child Speech Committee. In this second panel meeting, invited speakers, Professor Susan Rvachew from McGill University in Montreal, Professor Tricia McCabe from the University of Sydney in Australia, and Dr Edwin Maas from Temple University in Philadelphia will discuss the relationship between speech sound disorder and childhood apraxia of speech, and consider how motor planning disorders should be classified in children. First of all, just to tell you a little bit about IALP, it recently renamed as the International Association of Communication Sciences and Disorders. IALP is the non-state actor in official relations with the World Health Organization and thus represents speech and language therapists and pathologists, audiologists, and phoniatricians across the globe. We're presenting this panel series in order to serve our vision to facilitate better understanding, knowledge, and care of all of those with communication and swallowing disorders, and to further our mission to improve their care and their quality of life. And you can follow IALP at the Twitter handle at IALP_global. Now, just go on to a little bit about this panel series. Terminology in the field of speech-language pathology, we know, is an ongoing area of contention. We use many terms, but often the same term may mean different things to different people, or we may have no term where differentiation is needed. Speech sound disorder is now commonly used to describe many children with childhood speech disorders, but SSD itself covers a range of conditions and presentations. It also overlaps with other labels. In this series, we're going to explore the term SSD or speech sound disorder and how it relates to different conditions and how that affects how we might describe and define children's presentations and needs. This panel series covers 4 broad areas as shown on this slide. In October, our first panel started the terminology discussion with SSD and DLD, asking where do they overlap and where do they separate? And the recording of that session is available on the IALP website. In the second panel today, we'll be considering SSD as a general term and CAS or childhood apraxia of speech to explore how motor planning disorders should be classified in children. In our third panel, in the new year, together with the IALP Cleft Palate and Craniofacial Committee, we'll explore how anatomy and physiology affect the way we label and describe children with SSD. And for our final panel with other members of the Child Speech Committee, we'll consider the distinction between SSD and speech difference, with a particular focus on diverse communities. So now to introduce our speakers today, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Susan Rvachew, Edwin Maas, and Tricia McCabe. So Professor Susan Rvachew, Asher Fellow, is currently Director of the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders at McGill University. Her research is concerned with speech development from infancy through early childhood, evidence-based practice for the assessment and speech and treatment of speech sound disorders, and the prevention of literacy delays in this population. Susan will introduce the topic and discuss her own research on children with speech delay. She'll hand over then to Professor Edwin Maas of Temple University. Edwin received a master's degree in neurolinguistics from the University of Groningen and worked as a clinical linguist at the Rotterdam Aphasia Foundation before pursuing his PhD in language and communication disorders from San Diego State University and the University of California. His early research focused on verb and sentence processing in aphasia and basic mechanisms of sentence comprehension. His interest in treatment research led him to shift focus to speech production and its disorders, and to supplement his background in neurolinguistics, he obtained a postdoctoral training at Boston University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a focus on speech motor control. He joined Temple University's Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders in 2015. As co-director of the Speech, Language and Brain Laboratory, he conducts research on speech production across the lifespan in unimpaired individuals and in various populations with speech-language disorders. Two central overarching questions motivate and drive his research. What is the underlying nature of a given speech disorder, and how can we optimize treatment for speech disorders? His research has been funded by the US National Institutes of Health, Apraxia Kids, and the American Speech Language Hearing Foundation. Edwin will sketch a theoretical framework that can help inform our thinking about different speech sound disorders. Edwin will hand over to Professor Tricia McCabe. Tricia is a speech pathologist and researcher at the University of Sydney, Australia, and a private practitioner in Sydney. Her research, teaching, and clinical practice are focused on improving diagnosis, treatment, and lifetime outcomes for people with moderate to severe speech sound disorders. She has led the development of rapid syllable transition treatment as an intervention for childhood apraxia of speech, and is currently the chief investigator on an international multi-site RCT examining the effectiveness of dynamic temporal and tactile cueing compared with usual care. Tricia is going to try to marry the clinical with the theoretical and the implications of that. So we are keen for everybody listening to be able to engage in a discussion of the issues raised in the presentations today. There are more than 400 of you registered here for this evening, and also many who will watch the recorded version. So we're ready for some interesting discussion to take place. There are too many of you to use a chat function for questions, so we encourage you to use Twitter to provide comments today. Please use the hashtag SSDCAS and also tag at IALP_global. Also, if you could like comments from others, we'll try to pick these up with the most likes, pick up the ones with the most likes in a discussion afterwards. So many thanks in advance to Dr. Yvonne Wren, our committee chair, who's monitoring the Twitter feed as we go. If you don't use Twitter, there's an option to email, and you can address your emails to Helen Grech from the University of Malta, who's ready to pick these up now at helen.grech@um.edu.mt. And if you're not watching this live, but are watching after the event, please do still engage with the discussion on Twitter, and also take the opportunity to discuss the content with colleagues. As already mentioned, the session is being recorded and a link will be put on the IALP website. I'm now going to hand over to Susan to begin our series. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Eileen, for that introduction. I'm Susan Rvachew. I'm very pleased to present the first short piece in this panel presentation. I begin by saying that I'm speaking virtually from McGill University, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous people whose footsteps have marked this territory on which the people of the world now gather. I'm going to begin by kind of setting some boundaries around the conversation that we're going to have today within the context of Larry Schreiberg's speech disorders classification system. And then I'll present the characteristics of children in the category that he called speech delay, using data from studies that I conducted with former doctoral students, in particular Françoise Brassot-Lapré and Tanya Matthews. The speech disorders classification system was first introduced by Larry Schreiberg in the 1990s, and it's had several updates since then. It's a medical model. It's intended to support research into different subtypes of speech sound disorder that are differentiated by distinctive distal and proximal causal factors. In the clinical domain, it's meant to be helpful because children whose speech sound disorder is defined by a distinct etiology should respond preferentially to a treatment that is personalized to the child's clinical profile. The part of the classification system that's relevant to today's series of talks differentiates speech delay from motor speech disorders. So in the speech delay column, there's actually several different types of speech delay that are talked about here. But I'm going to kind of lump them all together because they're all thought to be underlyingly cognitive linguistic in nature. The definition of this category is significant substitution and deletion errors, not observed in most age peers, that impact intelligibility and that typically resolve with treatment. The underlying impairments appear to be with encoding, storing, or retrieving representations of speech. Then on the other side, we have motor speech disorders. And again, there's several different types of motor speech disorders, but we will be focusing on childhood apraxia of speech, defined as a neurological childhood speech sound disorder in which the precision and consistency of movements underlying speech are impaired in the absence of neuromuscular deficits. And the core impairment in planning or programming spatiotemporal parameters of movement sequences results in errors in speech sound production and in prosody. So the central question for us today is whether these broad categories are distinct, as illustrated in this classification system and on this slide, or whether they might overlap as shown here. Now, I indicated that there's a traditional division between these categories in speech language pathology and in communication sciences disorders research, but the presence of a sharp dividing line has been questioned by researchers many times in the past. For example, Barbara Lewis studied family aggregation among children with speech and language delay versus those with childhood apraxia of speech, and she concluded that the findings support the hypothesis of a continuum of impairment in a common verbal trait. So in this case, there isn't really a sharp dividing line. In order to consider this question, we need a scheme for describing these subtypes, and we can go back to the Lurie-Schreiber scheme for this. So I'm focusing on speech delay, but this descriptive schema can be applied to any other type of speech disorder. So the distal causes include biological and environmental factors, and these may interact. For example, genetic substrates that are also associated with dyslexia have been identified for speech delay. Smith and Pennington suggested that speech and reading shared neurological functions whose development is supported or disrupted by the same genes. But a home environment that supports strong growth in vocabulary skills can be protective, whereas a poor language environment or a otitis media, which disrupts your access to that environment, these kinds of factors may exacerbate the impact of this genetic profile. In turn, the distal causes impact neurodevelopment specifically in the region of phonological processing and phonological memory. And these phonological processing deficits are the proximal causal factors that account for the phenotype, that is, the observable characteristics of the speech delay. I'm going to say a bit more about these proximal causal factors. The proximal causes of speech delay have been really well established in the literature and are shown here in data taken from a recent meta-analysis by Hernshaw et al. The forest plot represents the effect size from many studies in which the speech perception skills of normally developing children were compared to the speech perception skills of children with speech delay. And so what we have are effect sizes on the I always get this mixed up because I'm not very smart anymore. This is the horizontal axis, and then we have a whole bunch of studies here on the vertical axis, and this line is the 0 point. So if all these blue dots lined up on 0, that would mean that there was no difference between these groups, but in fact, these blue dots are all on the right-hand side, indicating that children with normally developing speech have much better speech perception skills than children who have speech sound disorders. And so this is a really consistent and long-standing finding. It's something about which there's no doubt. And then when we look at phonological awareness, we have the same finding. It looks odd because the chart is reversed because now we're comparing children with speech delay to children with normally developing speech and finding that kids with speech delay have much worse phonological awareness skills than children with normally developing speech. And it's a very consistent finding. There's a lot of variability in the placement of these orange dots, and that is because the type of phonological awareness test that you use might make a difference. And the exact subtypes of children that you test might make a difference. So if we look at this orange dot here, for example, this particular group of children, they had language delay from when they were young, and they had speech delay from when they were young. And when they went into school, they still had language delay and speech delay. So there were persistent delays in these areas, and their phonological awareness skills, they were really, really bad. And then when we look at this orange dot is much closer to the 0 line, but it's still a very significant delay. And what's interesting about these kids is they did not have any language delay. They did have speech delay as preschoolers, but when they went into school, the speech delay was normalized. So they went into school with good speech, but they have a significant phonological awareness delay. So this association of phonological awareness problems with a current or previous speech delay is another very well-known finding. So now we can talk about the phenotype. What happens when kids have this problem? What does it look like on the surface? So I have some data here from one of my own studies. And I'm going to take a little detour here through Barbara Dodd's perspective, because she has made a big deal about there being a difference between speech delay or phonological delay and phonological disorders on the basis of the surface kind of error patterns that you see. Because kids with speech delay, they have consistent error patterns in their speech that you can identify. And sometimes the error patterns are the kinds of error patterns that you see in normally developing children, and other times they're kind of odd. We say that they're atypical. You don't often see them. And there's some question about whether these atypical errors are diagnostically significant in some way. And I'm not really sure that they are. I don't think that there's any real point in differentiating the disorder from the delay. So what we see here is I assessed 58 children in the year before kindergarten, and they're divided into severity intervals, severe, moderate, mild, on the basis of their percentile rank on the Goldman-Fristow test of articulation. And then we classified their production of all the target sounds as being correct. That's the blue part. Distortion, which is the red part. Typical segment error is the green part. Typical syllable structure error is the purple part. Atypical segment error is the blue part. And atypical syllable structure error is the orange part. And what we see here is that, first of all, these kids, they all have mostly typical errors and some atypical errors, but there are less and less atypical errors as the severity level goes down. So there's this real severity gradient with this thing. And then we looked at them again a year later when they were in kindergarten, and what we see is that the children are now older and the severity of their speech problem is getting less, right? So now some of the kids are within the normal range, more of them are mild, and so on. And we did the same kind of analysis of their errors. And what you see is that the atypical errors are just kind of getting pushed off the top of the bars because they're growing out of these errors. And I'm just not so sure that they're really that diagnostically significant, because there's something that's kind of developmental about atypical errors. Even if we think of normal development, very, very young children, if you look at toddlers, they produce some pretty strange errors. And so it's very atypical for 3 and 4 and 5-year-old children to be gliding their fricatives. But when you're 2 years old, it's not actually all that atypical. So I'm not sure that these error types are that important from the point of view of diagnosis. But in more recent work, I have come to really agree with Barbara Dodd on the question of this category called inconsistent deviant phonological disorder. So here we find that there's a group of children who, first of all, have very significant problems with phonological memory. And you can see this by giving the kids a test of phonological memory. This is called the non-word repetition task for speakers with misarticulations, developed by Schreiber and his colleagues. And you ask them to repeat these very simple strings of nonsense word syllables. And as the items get longer, the kids have more trouble with it. And phonological memory problems go along with phonological planning problems really closely. And these children who have this problem, they produce very inconsistent errors for a particular pattern. So if we look at the S clusters here, snake, we have cluster reduction, spider, we have a backing error, swing, we have a stopping error, school, another velar fronting, and splash, we have coalescence errors. So a lot of different types of errors. And also if the child were to say spider 3 times over, I don't know what this child was going to do. So there's a lot of inconsistency in this child's speech. But it doesn't look like apraxia of speech to us. It looks like a different animal called phonological planning disorder. And a question for me is whether this particular subtype of speech disorder, whether it's distinct and unique within the population of kids who have a cognitive linguistic issue, or whether it overlaps with the population of kids who have a motor planning disorder. And I'm not real sure about that. And so I am going to stop now and yield the floor to Edwin Maas, who might have something to say about it.
So what I want to do here today is sort of follow up where Susan left off and talk a little bit about what it might mean in terms of underlying processes when we talk about different kinds of speech disorders and the errors that we see. So here's some brief disclosures. I will be brief about that because we just lost some time, but I do get paid, and Temple resides on the land of Indigenous people as well. One thing to note is I'm not a speech language pathologist. Just wanted to have that out of the way. Here's my plan for my brief section here. So first I want to briefly sketch what I see as some of the problems, and then I'll talk a little bit about the processes involved in speech production, and then I will try to illustrate some of these processes and how they might relate to speech sound disorders. This will not be comprehensive. This will not be super detailed given the time, and then we'll briefly wrap up with implications. So to set the stage, I think in the original version, or one of the original versions of the speech sound disorders classification system that Susan mentioned, there was this sort of top level of speech sound disorder. So I consider that sort of like the umbrella term that is like one big category, but within that we have different diagnostic classifications, and I'm putting them in quotation marks here because I'm not wedded to any of those really. And there may be more, and there's some overlap. I mean, this is a very simplistic Venn diagram, but that sort of captures the complexity, I think. So the problem, sort of the title of this particular panel was how should motor speech disorders be classified in children? And I sort of infer from that, or that implies to me that there's a challenge in differentiating among different speech sound disorders, and perhaps even within broad categories of speech sound disorders. So the way I interpret that is that's essentially a question of what exactly goes wrong. So I come at this from the perspective more of, let's think about how it's supposed to work, and then let's think about what might break down. So what exactly goes wrong? How do those children differ? And so I've been adopting a bit of a process-oriented approach to thinking about assessment and diagnosis, where you essentially start with a theory of some underlying set of processes, rather than starting from a description of the surface behaviors like the error patterns and so on, but like really sort of turn that around and say, okay, well, here's the process. What would happen if this were broken? What are the errors that you might expect? I'm going to focus here on the proximal causes in the proximal causes box that Susan laid out, and in particular, I'll focus on the sort of psycholinguistic processes and sensory motor planning processes. Now, in order for this to work, of course, you have to have a theory of speech production, and within that, you need to be able to formulate specific hypotheses about what that impairment might be, because it turns out there may be multiple ways things can go wrong. So I'm going to take as my starting point here sort of like a mash-up model that's largely based on the Leyfeld model, incorporates some aspects of Frank Gunther's model, Van der Merwe model, and so on. So I'm not going to belabor this, but it starts essentially with having something to say, grammatically encoding that, and then we get to phonological encoding. So I'm going to start highlighting there. And at the phonological encoding stage, children are supposed to find the sound structure, assemble the sound structure So that's not well, I'll get back to that in a moment. Once they have found the sound structure of the word, like sort of the target sounds, if you will, or target representations, then the challenge becomes for the child to speak to figure out which movements will make those sounds and which muscles will make those movements to make those sounds. All of that involves processing sensory feedback as well. So very simplistically then, we might think of those kids with a speech delay, the cognitive linguistic ones, as having a phonological disorder, which I'm denoting PD here, as having some problem in that blue box, whereas children with child apraxia speech are supposedly having problems with the planning and programming of movement, so more in that green area. Now, this, again, as I said, is a relatively simplistic model, but one of the things I want to highlight here is that those green and blue boxes, they're not processes, they're processing stages. And each of those involves, multiple steps or mechanisms or processes and so on. So what I want to do here briefly is highlight how you might think about speech sound disorders, in particular phonological and child apraxia speech. So if we think of the phonological encoding stage as conceptualized in the Leveld model, as I'm doing here, let's say you have a thought about wanting to say, name this picture. I'm skipping over all the earlier parts. I'm going to go straight to the phonological piece here. As it turns out, there are several processes thought to occur during this stage of processing. One of those is retrieving the phonemes that are associated with that word. So, there's supposedly some repository of phonemes in your head, and you have to activate or retrieve the right ones. You also separately, but at the same time, have to retrieve the metrical frame. That is, a specification of the number of syllables, stress pattern, and so on. Those are two separate processes. And then there's a third process that assembles them, that puts them together, that puts the segments or the phonemes into those frames while following universal and language-specific cell amplification rules. So that is over here, down here. The end of that set of processes then is a representation that we refer to as the abstract phonological word here. So that specifies, the phonemes, but it does not have any concrete detail about how to make those sounds. We'll get to that later. Now, within this context, within this kind of thinking about phonological encoding, there are multiple processes, as I said. What that also means is there are multiple ways in which things can go wrong and multiple places where things can go wrong. So if we think about the phonological disorders of the consistent type, what we often think of the kids with patterned errors, one way to conceptualize that in this kind of framework is to say, well, maybe those kids just don't have those particular phonemes yet. And so they're consistently substituting with something that is similar to that or that they're able to do. Or they may consistently omit that sound, because if it's not there, if it's not in the repository, they can never produce it. So that would be consistent. It's also possible that there's missing frames, that maybe not all frames are developed. And so what that would lead to is potentially syllable deletions if there's a syllable missing. So it might lead to, boomerang or something. And it may also lead to consistent stress errors, because if a child does not have, for example, the weak-strong frame well represented, they may choose the strong weak pattern, and so you might end up with a more consistent stress error pattern, or stress pattern error. So those are some possible ways to think of that. When we think about inconsistent phonological disorders, the assumption is that all the sounds are there, all the phonemes are in the repository where they're supposed to be, but now the problem is one of access. Now the problem is one of retrieving those phonemes or frames. And so if it's a problem of retrieval rather than existence of that representation, then what you might expect to find there is that there may be substitutions and omissions, but they may be variable. And sometimes a child might get the word correct, and sometimes they don't. So because it's not an issue of the sound isn't there, it's just a problem in access. There could also be a problem with assembly. So maybe there's not a problem with retrieving the phonemes or in the frames, but maybe there's a problem in putting those together according to language-specific and universal rules. So what that might lead to is that maybe sometimes sounds end up in the wrong location within that frame. So you might get sequencing errors. And they may be variable, they may not always be the same. This is very similar to the kinds of phonological problems that we see in adults with aphasia, for example, because adults with aphasia tend to not show consistent patterns phonologically. So this is one way to conceptualize an inconsistent phonological disorder from Dodd's classification. So that's phonological planning. I'm switching briefly now to speech motor planning, and where we're sort of in the domain of apraxia speech. What I'm going to do here, or what I'm going to try to do here, is briefly explain this very, very complex model that has lots and lots of further detail. But I'm going to try to focus on the relevant pieces here. This is a simplified version of the DIVA model that Frank Gunther developed. And essentially, it's a model that takes as an input that phonological word, let's say, that we just talked about, that's sort of that's fed into this next stage, where we have what's called a speech sound map. And that speech sound map, you could think of that as sort of like a placeholder for a motor plan. Activating a motor plan, let's say, in the speech sound map does two things. One is it sets up expectations for the speaker. So there's a certain auditory expectation. You know, if I say the word boomerang, I expect to hear a certain sequence of acoustic inputs. Similarly, I set up expectations for what I would expect somatosensorily. So, for example, with boomerang, it starts with lip closure. I might expect to feel lips coming together, tactile contact. Now, then what I do is I compare the current state with what I'm expecting, what I should be hearing. And if there is a difference, if those two are not the same, then there's an error that's generated. There's a difference between what I'm expecting and what I'm actually hearing, which is then transformed into a corrective motor command that is added to the final motor command. So there's an online correction. So if I start going, oh, if I'm on the way to saying boomerang, I might detect that and say boomerang, like I sort of correct on the fly. You can do the same thing with somatosensory errors. Now, you may wonder, how do children know how to correct this? That is thought to be done based on so-called systemic mappings, where during babbling, children babble, and essentially what they're trying to do there is figure out what happens when I do this. What sound do I get when I lower my tongue? For example. So they learn what effects particular movements have on the resulting acoustics. So that's a process of learning. Now, the next stage of learning, typically, is now children have a particular target. Now they might want to say a particular word, like pie, for example. And they have an auditory target region for that. They kind of know what that's supposed to sound like because they've heard others say it. But now they have to actually try and say that as well. And so they make some guess based on their knowledge of those systemic mappings. And so they may send out a so-called predictive motor command or feed-forward command, which represents essentially their best guess at the movements needed to produce that sound. early on, they make mistakes. And so there's lots of errors being detected that have to then be corrected and so on. But over time, the idea is that these predictive motor commands, those feed-forward motor commands, become tuned to the goal by incorporating some of those corrections that have happened in the past. So that over time, speakers don't have to wait for that feedback mismatch, but they can, issue a motor command sort of in a predictive way without having to wait for that feedback. So the final motor command is a combination of feed-forward and feedback. Early on in development, there's a greater reliance on feedback, but that then helps tune up the feed-forward command so that adult speakers tend to rely much more on feed-forward control. Okay, that's essentially, in a nutshell, the model. Now, when we think about apraxia of speech, there's many different ways things can go wrong. One possibility is that there is a problem in this feed-forward system, and this is a hypothesis that's been put forward. It could explain things having to do that we often see. So, if you have difficulty, if you don't have a good feed-forward system, you're necessarily going to rely more on feedback control, because you're generating more errors, and so the feedback system kicks in more. But the feedback system is a little slower, because it has to wait until that feedback has been processed. It may be more variable because it's making these corrections on the fly. Because of that slowness and these online changes, there may be differences in co-articulatory patterns and so on. The other thing is, because in this case, children would rely more on auditory feedback, they should be more affected when that feedback is removed. So you would expect greater disruption of their speech under conditions of noise masking, for example. And that has been demonstrated. Jenny Zygo has demonstrated that. So because in this case, if children rely more on this and we take that away, they should get worse. It's also possible that there's an auditory feedback problem, rather. Now, of course, if that happens during early development, that will complicate the development further of feed-forward systems. But one possibility would be here, or one hypothesis might be that masking noise doesn't have an effect, or maybe it even has a positive effect, because if this is the problem, then what this system may be doing is sending unnecessary corrections. Maybe it's detecting errors that aren't there. Maybe it's sending incorrect corrective commands, and now you end up with a noisy signal, so to speak. And maybe quieting that system down will let the feed-forward system or the somatosensory feedback control system take over and maybe be more consistent. There may also be speech perception difficulties if there's a problem there that would at least explain or would at least be consistent with something like that. Of course, there could be another problem in the somatosensory regions as well. So similar things there. The point of all of this is to suggest that not all motor planning disorders or all phonological disorders are necessarily the same. And, there are different parts of the system that could be independently impaired, so to speak. And our challenge then is to figure out ways to test the integrity of those systems. I want to just briefly put this all back together before I wrap up, because I don't want to take too much time. But essentially, the way I'm conceptualizing this then is not just that there's an umbrella for speech sound disorder category, but there's little umbrellas for phonological disorder, and there's a little umbrella for childhood apraxia of speech, because each of those may represent a category or a group of possible impairments. And these are just illustrations. These are not the only possible ways, of course, but these are some of the ways in which you can think about that. Okay, so to wrap up, one implication here is that a broad diagnostic label may actually cover a bunch of different underlying impairments. So that's the umbrella idea. One way to think about that is to say that there could be potential subtypes within each broad category. So the question is not just how do you differentiate a phonological from motor problem, but the question gets more refined or fine-grained. What kind of phonological disorder? what kind of motor planning problem, what is the impaired process or mechanism. So it requires us to think a little bit differently, because it starts essentially from a model to then, figure out, how do we test this? How do we see whether this process is intact, yes or no, rather than starting from, okay, I'm seeing these errors, now let's try to make sense from those inductively, so to speak. So there's an induction, deduction kind of difference in a way, I suppose. Now, I want to be clear that this will require some development probably of additional techniques and measures, that may not be standardly used in clinical practice. Like the noise masking manipulation, for example, is probably not standard, but that might be informative. This brings me to the reality check. I am not claiming that all of this is ready to go and that all of these things have been worked out and that there is a comprehensive set of tests and measures available so far. This is still in development because validating all these things takes time. But there have been some initial steps in that direction, at least in Dutch. Van Haften and Ben Maas and his group have developed sort of like a process-oriented computerized articulation instrument. Which brings me then to, why do we even care about this? You're telling me about all this theory. Why do I care, right? I don't care about labels for the sake of labels. So my interest in doing this work is not because I find it fun to slap little labels on kids with different problems. The point of all this is the underlying belief or the assumption that different underlying problems require different solutions. And so at least when you do impairment-focused treatment, then the idea is that you can be more effective if you target the actual underlying impairment rather than just the overall label. So that is my handoff to Tricia.
All right, I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm working today. That's the Gadigal and Wongal people of the Eora Nation. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and any First Peoples present with us today. Right, well, Susan and Edwin have given us quite a theoretical spin, and I want to try and shift to a bit of a clinical spin. A lot of what I'm talking about today is trying to marry, as Aileen said, trying to marry the clinical with the research. So in the first talk on where do SSD and language fit together, Helen Stringer proposed a model, and I just want to revise it because it helped me think about what I want to talk about today. So she suggested that we have this overarching category called speech sound disorder, and underlying that, we can think about speech sound disorders of a known origin and speech sound disorders of an unknown origin. And so we have speech disorders that are associated with many other medical and genetic conditions. And what we're finding as we go along is that more and more of the disorders that we thought were of unknown origin are turning out to be of origin. There are some 20 genes, for example, that are now associated with either apraxia or dysarthria. She then suggested that there was a third category, a third level, which was motor speech sound disorders versus linguistic speech sound disorders. And both Susan and Edwin have talked about that today. What was different, and this is what Edwin enumerated well, was that in fact they overlap. And so while we might have a motor speech disorder, and Helen proposed that articulation, childhood apraxia, speech and dysarthria might fit into one category and linguistic might fit into the other, that in fact children can have a known origin and have dysarthria and a phonological delay. They can have a motor speech disorder that is of known or unknown origin. So I wanted to revise that as a way of introducing where I started with my thinking. The second idea I wanted to canvas before I get into some more depth is that development is dynamic. Children do not develop their speech in isolation. So their physical traits, their speech development, language, cognition, these are all internal to them and interacting continuously in the child. And all of those internal factors are interacting with their family, their environment, and the socioeconomic system that they live in. So we have this very complex, very dynamic interaction of elements. And so if we think about linguistic and motor speech sound disorders, and then we think about childhood apraxia in particular, we have to understand that children are developing all of their capacities simultaneously. So it is tempting to think about a motor speech disorder and a linguistic disorder. And as you can see here, if you had a motor speech disorder such as childhood apraxia of speech in the blue, you would just treat the motor speech disorder. Or if you had a phonological disorder, you would just treat the phonological disorder. But in fact, most kids are a bit of one and a bit of the other. And if we think about this, as a child with a motor speech disorder such as apraxia, is having difficulty making phonemes, making word structures and so forth. They don't learn that these contrasts are meaningful because they get their message across through another way, because they don't have the opportunity to play with the sounds, to experiment what happens when they change the sound, when they use the correct sound and the incorrect sound. So even if they didn't start off with a motor speech disorder, even if they started off with a motor speech disorder, there becomes a phonological consequence of having a motor speech disorder. Likewise, at the linguistic end, a child with a significant phonological disorder is not learning to make the motor patterns. They're not doing that practice that Edwin was talking about a moment ago. And so we end up with a child whose underlying cause might be linguistic, but they have a motor problem. So we think about the child with multiple phonological processes who has fronting. Now, they don't learn the contrast between alveolar and velar, and when they acquire it, they haven't got the motor skills. They haven't learned to independently elevate the rear of their tongue without elevating the tip of their tongue. And so they don't and they can't. And many clinicians will have had the experience of having the child have the light bulb moment, realise that, oh, I've got to put that sound there, and then telling you that they can't make it. That's a motor problem that has arisen because of their linguistic problem. So I want to start by saying I think SSD is a superordinate category for linking all these things together, but I don't think it's a useful category for understanding what's happening in child speech. It doesn't tell you what's happening for the child. It doesn't tell you what to treat or how, and it doesn't help you understand that speech disorder interacts with all the other systems. You can see I've got that umbrella metaphor going as well. So let's just take a step back. As a researcher, when I recruit children for a study, I'm looking for category X. I'm looking for children, for the most part, who only have childhood apraxia of speech, or who only have dysarthria, or who only have a phonological impairment, because I'm testing an intervention. In the case of REST intervention, we designed it based on ideas that had been clinically used, but we designed it to deal with the features of childhood apraxia of speech: inconsistency, difficulty transitioning from syllable to syllable, and difficulty with lexical stress. So we designed it with a theoretical framework in mind to deal with the problems that are core in childhood apraxia of speech. What that means is we rule out children who have other disorders. So we don't include children with an intellectual disability. We don't include children with dysarthria and so forth. So for us, the cleaner the sample, the better. And therefore, if we see a treatment effect, then it's because of the treatment and not because of the confounding or complicating factors. But of course, this is not the way for clinicians. Clinicians deal with the hybrid, the mix and match, because children don't come in neat boxes. They're every possible combination of features, both of their speech and all of those other factors. And As a result, evidence-based practice requires clinicians to balance the research evidence with their clinical data and experience and informed patient choice. Researchers don't have to do that. We have the privilege of just focusing on the research and not taking into account those other factors. So, how should CAS be classified? I think what we need to do, first of all, is do better detailed description, both in our research and also in our clinical work. Describing your client accurately and in detail will allow you to match your client to the research literature and cover that corner of EBP. However, it also leads to better treatment planning and better measurement of your progress. I think it's important to think about that informed patient choice. And in the most case for children with speech sound disorders, whether it's childhood apraxia speech or a phonological impairment, parents want to know what's going on. They want a label, they want a diagnosis, they want explanations, and then they want support and intervention if that's appropriate. At this point, and Susan mentioned Barbara Lewis's work, and there are others too, what we know about what happens going forward sits with the diagnosis. Now, that may not be accurate, but that is, we know that a motor speech disorder has this prognosis, whereas a phonological disorder has a different one. Even though they may overlap, we need to know that the child has both a motor speech disorder, such as childhood apraxia speech, and potentially either independently or as a consequence, they have a phonological disorder. So I want to jump into my own research for a minute. And here, this is a study from Liz Murray as part of work that we did for a treatment study. In the treatment study, which is published with the same authors in 2015, we looked for children in our community in Sydney who had childhood apraxia of speech. We used two sets of diagnostic criteria. One, the core or the consensus features in the ASHA technical report of inconsistency, difficulty transitioning between sounds and between syllables, and inappropriate lexical and phrasal stress. But because it was research, we went on and also examined these children using a different set of criteria, some of which line up with the ASHA technical criteria and some of them don't. And you can see them on the right-hand side of the screen there. In this case, using the Schreiber, Potter and Strand checklist, you need to have at least 4 out of the 10 features, and you need to see them repeatedly over a number of tasks. And just for the researchers in the audience, Liz and I agreed 100% on which children had apraxia and which children did not. So what did we find? We had 72 inquiries. These are families asking us about the research who believed their child had apraxia and who had had a conversation with their clinician that said that much. In the phone screening, 25 out of those 72 failed the phone screening, and we don't have further details of them. 47 passed and then had a detailed assessment which went over about 4 hours. Of those 47, 15 did not have apraxia, 28 had apraxia, and 4 had both apraxia and dysarthria. The clinicians, a dysarthria or a language disorder, the clinicians had missed the dysarthria, so they had rolled the dysarthria into the apraxia. And I can see how that would happen, but a detailed oromusculature evaluation or assessment would help you sort that out. It's not something clinicians are always comfortable doing, but it is something that's important. I want to focus in on the children who didn't have apraxia, so not on its own or with others. So here we had 3 children who had undiagnosed submucous clefts, 2 with dysarthria alone, 8 with complex phonological impairments with or without phonological processing as well. So there was input and output phonological issues. And there were 2 children who had a combination of a stutter and a phonological disorder. These 2 worry me greatly because they should have seen a medical professional to work out what was going on. And in fact, I think the submucous cleft children, we've got a significant ethical dilemma here, because really they needed surgery, and the eldest of those was 8, an 8-year-old who'd had 5 years worth of therapy for childhood apraxia of speech, who did not have childhood apraxia of speech. And she had had 3 speech and language therapists along the way. I have a suspicion what happened was the first one couldn't do an oral musculature evaluation, and then the second and third ones assumed that the first one had done it. And I think that is cause for pause for all of us. So this study showed that childhood apraxia of speech was overdiagnosed in the Australian community-based speech pathologists, and that's consistent with other findings. And it also showed that there are ethical issues that we have to consider in missing the submucous cleft or the dysarthria. And I want to flag the resonance issues and dysarthria as underdiagnosed generally, that community clinicians often miss a resonance problem, not a submucous cleft, but often miss resonance, and they often miss dysarthria. So why do these things happen? I think because of the need for an oral musculature assessment, because the complex phonology reduces the child's capacity, and potentially if it's an input phonology, they're not even aware that they're making the mistakes, that clinicians used inconsistent production and slow progress, even though probably neither of those are diagnostic on their own. I think there's somewhat of an expertise aura. I like to talk about voice oogie boogie, that voice clinicians have an aura that says you have to be an expert. But I think resonance clinicians, so the cleft palate teams, throwing out the challenge to Yvonne here, the cleft palate teams have this as well. Only an expert can do this, and I, as your community clinician, can't do this. And we heard last time that in some countries, for example, Denmark, and I know from my own experience in Italy, some of the classifications can't be diagnosed by a speech pathologist in that country. But I think importantly, speech disorders are dynamic, and what seemed simple and obvious at 2 might have been complex at 4 or 5 because other things had emerged. And therapy may have worked and allowed the child to make more productions that allowed us to see what else was going on. So arriving at a diagnosis can be complex. The more severe the speech disorder, the more time you need, and we know time is the one thing clinicians don't have. We need to consider, based on theory and on research, we need to consider what the child can do independently. So what their inventory is, but also their accuracy. And here, I'd refer to Elise Baker's and Sharon McLeod's work, but also to think about what their strengths are. It helps us, an independent inventory helps us think about what that child's strengths are. We need to know about their spontaneous versus their imitated productions. We need to know about their variability across tasks versus their consistency within tasks. And that, can you do the same thing over and over again? Consistency tells us different things than whether they can do it in the word final versus word initial. We need to know about their change with complexity, intensity, or speed, and we need to know about the psychosocial impacts. And I think we undervalue dynamic assessment. And here, in terms of childhood apraxia of speech, we can think about Strand's dynamic evaluation of motor speech skills, but all of us know that we learn more about the child from a therapy trial. And so I think that using the kinds of tasks that Edwin's talking about and that Susan's talking about will help us understand that the child is a complex creature who has a number of different capacities. So in CAS, we have a whole lot of research conundrums. The research participants' characteristics are not the same as the child in front of me. Slow progress in therapy is not diagnostic of childhood apraxia of speech. I think it's diagnostic of misdiagnosis or perhaps diagnostic of poor, inability to match the child with the appropriate intervention. I've already mentioned that. So one of the things when you're the second or the third clinician to see a child or the child is older, then sometimes we have to undo what is done before. I'm not sure whether groping is central to childhood apraxia of speech or not, because I see children and their parents have been helping them speak. Their previous clinicians have been helping them speak. And do we cause groping? I don't know. What about syllable segregation? Early interventions such as the Nuffield program teach children to do syllable by syllable, but then we have to bring them together. A lot of what we're doing is undoing what was done before, partly because we treated it as a sole diagnosis. And finally, almost finally, I'd like to just mention that I don't think CAS resolves. Our emerging research, on a student of mine, we've looked at speech and psychosocial impacts of childhood apraxia of speech. And what we're finding is that the more severe the speech disorder is in adulthood, the more severe they have psychosocial effects of that speech disorder. And that all of our participants reported hiding the fact that they have a speech disorder. So even though they might say that they're fully resolved, they avoid words, they avoid sounds, they avoid speaking contexts. And for those of you who are aware of the stuttering literature, this sounds just like the stuttering literature. So I think that we need to think through the lifetime, not only about the interaction of all the development factors, but also the prognosis and the psychosocial impacts. So in doing second opinion assessments, to come back to clinical, firstly, it often turns out to be something else. It turns out to be two diagnoses together, and both of those diagnoses are common. We end up with resonance problems, with nodules plus phonology, complex phonological disorders on their own, phonology plus resonance, plus or minus voice, voice plus phonology plus stutter, or a global developmental delay or autism plus a language delay. So these are all children who've been diagnosed external to me, come in, and when we slowly go through an assessment, because I have the luxury of time, we can unpack it to simple diagnoses together. The childhood apraxia of speech is uncommon, and we need to look first for the common things. So how should children with speech motor planning disorders be classified? Firstly, a speech motor planning disorder such as apraxia requires a speech motor treatment. Doing therapy changes the presentation of all speech disorders, and you need to treat what you see, but look carefully. So coming to the end here, if we think about our motor and linguistic, I think the outer boxes become less important. Your take-home messages are describe the child's strengths and difficulties, know that the child will have overlapping diagnoses which will change over time, and common things are common. And I would really like to get rid of the umbrella. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tricia. Thank you to all the speakers for a very interesting discussion there. So I was very taken with your very comprehensive overview, Susan, of the phonological disorders, and I found your discussion of error types really very interesting. And we have some questions coming in about that. I very much agree with your idea that atypical errors moving up and kind of disappearing from the scene with age. And I think this very much goes together with your idea, Tricia, of the dynamic development. So if we think of, when a child is acquiring speech, they are still acquiring their perceptual system and their perceptual abilities. They're still acquiring their motor abilities, and they're still acquiring cognitive linguistic abilities. And if they do this at different rates, then, you can get these mismatches occurring where they're more able to do some things than other things. And I think that idea of the dynamic development is really interesting in that way. And that's how we can see these kind of less typical errors. And one of the things that I remember very much from working with students on a research project where we assessed very many students, very many children with speech sound disorders, and the student coming and saying to me, but these atypical errors aren't at all atypical. because in a population of very young children with speech sound disorder, they are quite typical, and they're not randomly, they are very, very rule-based. And sometimes I think we say what's labeled as an atypical error is a really clever way to get round some of the difficulties that the child is having, where, for example, a child can't produce two elements of a cluster, but marks both elements by combining the features of both of the elements of the cluster into one phoneme. And I think we see children who are using some really clever strategies when part of that dynamic system hasn't developed yet. Edwin, your review gave us a model of a speech production system, which I think was really, really useful. It's an extremely clear model, and with those different disorders mapped onto breakdowns at different places in the model, that gives us a really useful guide to how to look for the underlying impairment rather than just trying to treat the symptoms. So we can really focus on the underlying cause of the problem. And I think you've already answered one of the questions that came in. Might you be able to describe, using the model, how to envision the differential breakdown occurring developmentally between CAS and another SSD, such as phonological disorder? And I think the model that you described and how you placed the areas of breakdown on it really answered that question. And that question had come in beforehand, so very interesting. So I'm going to kick off. We apologize to everybody for the technical difficulties we've had. It has robbed us a little bit of time. So I'm just going to kick off with a question that has come in from Caroline Bowen. So welcome, Caroline. It's very nice to have you here this evening. So Caroline says, Waring and Knight 2013 and Bauman Wengler 2020 and others amplify Schreiber's point regarding the speech disorder classification system is suitable for its original intent as a research framework. But the more I look at its 2019 iteration, the more I see its clinical utility. What does the panel think? So what does the panel think about the clinical utility of the speech disorder classification system? Susan, would you like to kick off with that one?
It's hard. I'm uncertain. So I think the best part of it is the basic framework of it. So the idea of the distal proximal causes and their relationship to the phenotype, I think is really, really good. I think that Barbara Lewis published a paper on the genetic causes of speech sound disorders, where she added some bits that had to do with interactions between different parts, and also brought in what Trish was talking about, which was these developmental effects, the fact that kids are changing over time, which I think is really, really important. The problem that I have with it from the clinical point of view is that there was always probably vain hope that all of the boxes would end up with a specific behavioral marker. And if you could just find the behavioral marker, you would know which box you were in. And it has never worked. It just has not worked. Every time Dr. Schreiber, bless his heart, thinks he has found the marker, and you think you found the marker, and you're like, because like one time he said that syllable deletion errors were the marker for genetic version of speech delay, right? You're like, that's it, that makes sense. But there is no subtype of speech sound disorder that does not have speech deletion errors associated with it. And similarly with the otitis media, every person who has ever done a study on the phenotypic characteristics of speech secondary to otitis media comes up with a different list. Not a single one of them is replicated. So I think from that point of view, there's a problem with it. But where it's excellent is setting up this framework that says you can think about the genotype, the endophenotype, the phenotype. And then where it helps us is we get to Edwin Maas's proposal, where he says, well, what if we think about the endophenotype? That's your processes in between. Maybe that's what helps us decide what kind of treatments we should use. Let's treat those proximal causes. And so there, I think it's really useful.
Edwin, would you like to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I agree with Susan about that. I think the latest iteration in the 2019 paper has added more of that explicitly to the system, the endophenotype part. And I think that part is, in my view, obviously I'm biased, that's the more useful part. I agree that most of the markers that have been proposed don't seem to hold up. I'm not sure how realistic it is that any of those would ever hold up, but I think that thinking about the processes is in my mind obviously very useful. So I agree with Susan on that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Tricia.
I think I agree with Susan and Edwin, but I would go one step further, and that is to say that I don't think we will ever find those markers, and I do wonder if it's research that in the future we'll think we could have looked for different things. I think the interactions of the systems, as Edwin was describing, is probably the process part is probably more useful than the categorization part. And I'm always uncomfortable with anything that has not elsewhere classified in it or not otherwise specified, which is what Schreiber has, because that suggests that you've just got a too hard box. So I value the work immensely, but I think it has, at this stage, limited clinical utility.
Okay, thank you. Another question that's here, I'm going to direct this at you, Tricia, because I've seen you speak recently on this. If you suspect dysarthria, does this need to be confirmed specifically by a neurologist?
So children with dysarthria sort of come in two categories. One is a known cause, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, and they will be under the care of a neurologist or a paediatrician, and I wouldn't feel necessarily to refer onwards for those. But a dysarthria of unknown origin absolutely needs to be medically examined in case it's representative of something that is emerging. We do have childhood degenerative conditions, and sometimes as a speech pathologist, we're the first group of professionals to see that. And so I would encourage that back referral. And of course, in many countries, dysarthria is not diagnosed by the speech and language therapist, but by a neurologist. So we need to be aware that there are differences there. So anything that looks weird or behaves weird needs to be examined more. Child with nasal regurgitation, that'd be a referral. Child with asymmetrical movement, that would be a referral. So, yes.
Thank you. Edwin, I think this question is interesting for you. There are so many theories out there. How do I know which one to use?
Great question.
Many of us will be asking that question.
Yeah, it's something that I've struggled with. So I think it's a useful thing to think about. It is absolutely the case that there are many different models out there. They all make slightly different assumptions or widely different assumptions. The way I'm sort of approaching this is to focus on the commonalities or focus on models, where well, models that lend themselves to thinking in my simplistic mind about speech disorders, but also focusing on the consensus. So the model that I sketched here, for example, is like a box and arrow model with stages of processing. Most models of speech production will assume something of that sort. They may differ in specific assumptions about the amount of feedback between those levels, for example. And those are not trivial. I don't mean to suggest that those are trivial, because they do have ramifications for what one might observe. But I would say focus on models, or focus sort of on the convergence of models, of assumptions, so that you're on most solid ground. But of course, if there's a new theory that comes out that presents a new conceptual framework to think about disorders, then it might be worth exploring that. But I think at this stage of the game, it makes the most sense to sort of like focus on a model that consists primarily of the things that most models would agree on. And you know, of course, those will be developed further, but that's sort of our approach so far.
Okay, thank you. Susan, this is a question about the classification that you were talking about. Barbara Dodd and her colleagues proposed that children with speech delay and children with consistent phonological disorder were fundamentally different, in that children with typical phonological error patterns were just coming along a bit slowly, whereas the children with consistent atypical error patterns have an impairment in the ability to abstract phonological rules from the input. Why have you concluded that these groups are fundamentally similar?
Well, the first thing is that, okay, so this again is an argument about similarities and differences at the level of the underlying phonological processes, the proximal causes, and then the differences at the level of the observable speech symptoms, and whether they make a difference, again, for how you might treat those children when they come into your clinic. And she has some reasons for saying that they're different based on researchers. So, for example, she said that the children who have atypical errors are going to have worse phonological awareness than the children who don't. But it's really hard to properly kind of match these kids across all of the variables that you might want to match them for cognitive skills, even for age. There's age gradients for them. For severity in their speech disorder, you almost can't match for that, and so on. And so I still have some difficulties being absolutely sure that they're really different. And there are some other studies suggesting that the kids are really not that much different on those underlying processes. And then in my own research, when I said, okay, so are these atypical errors, are they definitely predictive of things, of faster progress, of having a phonological awareness problem a year later when you're in kindergarten, of things like this? They weren't very predictive. Sometimes there seem to be small tendencies for kids with a reading problem to have atypical errors in the past as a group, but not really significantly different, just slight differences. And so in the end, it really, the data seemed really difficult for me to predict. And I just felt like there's not enough longitudinal research. So it just looks to me like some of these kids are just different steps along that developmental pathway in the way that Trish was saying. And so maybe they are even different, right? So if this kid has better phonological awareness skills than that kid, but a 4-year-old has better phonological awareness skills than a 3-year-old, and is less likely to have atypical errors as well. And so, but those kids are not genetically different. You know, that same child is not genetically different than he was when he was born or a year earlier or whatever. And that's what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about whether this group of kids is genetically different from that group of kids and therefore needs a different treatment and has a different prognosis and so on and so forth, because that's the medical model, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just not convinced of it. I think you go in and you treat what you see.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan. I'm just going to try and fit in one last question because I think this is interesting for all of us, and especially as clinicians. The time for assessment appears critical. How do we make a case for the time required for this for children with persistent, severe, and complex speech sound disorders? Tricia, you might want to start on that one.
Yes, of course I do. I need to start by being brave. We come from traditions that have us as a helping profession, as a, even just the overarching term of allied health, which is used in English-speaking countries as to encompass us and occupational therapy and physical therapy and so forth, suggests that we're not the main game. And I think I would encourage us all to be braver in conversations with our employers and our national bodies and our funding bodies. If you want me to spend less time doing therapy, you have to pay for more time doing assessment. And I think it's incumbent on the researchers to show that that's true. And that's a challenge I put out to all of us. But as a profession, as a global community, if we invest in diagnostic and assessment time, we will spend less time in treatment. And I'm convinced of that.
I will completely echo that. And Trish has her own examples of, a child who had submucous cleft and was not found in the longitudinal studies that we had. We had very occasionally children who were treated for apraxia of speech when they didn't have apraxia of speech and made zero progress for 3 years. And I'm not even saying that they were, making progress, but it wasn't, they didn't, make progress relative to their age. Zero progress, no progress, did not change the number of errors that they made, their intelligibility. Nothing happened for 3 years. And this is a crime. And it's because the diagnosis was wrong and the assessment was not deep enough and the targets that were chosen were completely wrong and the approach to therapy that was used was wrong. And as speech pathologists, we have to take responsibility for this. And we can't throw up our hands and say, my boss won't let me do assessments. We can't do this. We have to change it and we have to take responsibility for it.
I think we must all agree there. Absolutely. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time. And so I want to thank the panel very much for this really thought-provoking session and discussion, which I think has raised as many issues probably as it has answered, which is normally always the case. And of course, we recognize there's still work to go. Before we go, I have one last slide to show, which, Jonathan, if you can find that slide, it shows the dates for the remaining sessions. We'll be sharing information by Twitter and Eventbrite on how to register for the next event in February, where Dr. Val Pereira from the Chinese University of Hong Kong will be talking on the topic of how differences in anatomy and physiology affect the way we label and describe SSD in children. I just would like to thank all our speakers again, Susan, Edwin, and Tricia this evening for this fascinating discussion, and to thank all of you out there for joining us today. And if you want to recommend this panel session to your colleagues, the link for the recorded session will be available on Eventbrite and on the IALP website. I'm not sure if you can see the slides, but if so, I'll leave you with details of the 32nd World Congress of IALP and the hope that we will all actually be able to attend in person by 2023. And so this is the end of the session. And I'd like to wish you all either a very good rest of the day or good night, depending on where you are in the world. And goodbye, everybody, and thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you. Good evening.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.